Welcome to U.S. History since 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history after Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yop, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on Black Power, urban crisis, and the policing state. The core question is this: how did Black Power, urban protest, and anti-war dissent turn Vietnam-era distrust of authority into a demand for local control? The core competency is to illustrate the variety of counterculture movements unleashed during the Vietnam War. What kind of citizenship does a city offer when it promises equal membership in public language but delivers overcrowded housing, shrinking jobs, and police contact as the most reliable municipal service? Black Power and urban dissent during the Vietnam years grew from administrative betrayal more than mood or fashion. Northern and western cities like to congratulate themselves for lacking the formal Jim Crow codes of Mississippi or Alabama. Yet many black residents confronted segregated housing markets, failing schools, declining industrial employment, and police departments that operated as occupying forces rather than responsive civic institutions. The contradiction became impossible to hide once civil rights victories in the South raised expectations that law would alter daily life everywhere. This is why the late 1960s cannot be reduced to hair, slogans, or generational rebellion. Young black activists, anti-war campus organizers, and neighborhood leaders were reacting to a government that could draft men for Vietnam, build freeways through urban neighborhoods, subsidize white suburban escape, and expand police budgets faster than it could secure decent housing or community control. The counterculture side of Unit 5 belongs here because distrust of authority had more than one source. Some young organizers rejected Cold War conformity from campuses. Many black communities rejected municipal authority because they knew its street-level form. The city became a pressure chamber. Welfare offices could monitor poor families. Urban renewal authorities could condemn blocks in the name of progress. School boards could preserve segregation through district lines. Police could decide who belonged on a corner and who counted as threat. In that setting, Black Power named a demand for self-determination, local control, and dignity beyond the pace acceptable to white moderates. It also exposed how quickly national elites shifted from rights language to law and order language once urban unrest threatened property and electoral stability. The civic problem is direct. If integration into existing institutions leaves poor black neighborhoods governed by disinvestment and heavy policing, then the argument shifts from admission to power. Control over schools, patrol routes, public spending, and neighborhood safety becomes the center of conflict once formal equality no longer explains the depth of local anger. The world before Black Power was built across decades of migration and exclusion. During the Great Migration and Second Great Migration, millions of black Southerners moved to Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, Oakland, and other cities seeking industrial wages and political space unavailable under Southern segregation. They did not arrive in open civic terrain. Federal housing policy, private lending, restrictive covenants, and real estate steering concentrated black families in overcrowded neighborhoods where rents could be high and services poor. Redlining turned racial separation into finance. The homeowners' loan corporations' maps and later lending habits treated black neighborhoods as risky zones. FHA-backed suburban development helped white families accumulate home equity, while urban black renters faced contract sales, absentee landlords, and declining municipal investment. White flight then drained tax bases and political confidence from central city schools. When mayors and planners later spoke about urban crisis, they were often describing conditions produced by public policy rather than spontaneous neighborhood failure. Employment patterns added a second pressure. Industrial jobs had drawn migrants north and west, but by the 1960s, automation, plant relocation, suburban industrial parks, and deindustrialization were narrowing opportunity in many city neighborhoods. A worker could live near the old plant district and watch jobs move beyond bus reach or into suburban jurisdictions that still excluded black residents from housing. Legal equality and lunch counters did not solve the distance between a neighborhood and a paycheck. Urban renewal sharpened the injury. Federal grants and local redevelopment authorities cleared so-called blighted districts for highways, medical centers, university expansion, or commercial use. The slogan urban renewal often translated at street level into what critics called Negro removal. Families displaced from one overcrowded district were pushed into another. The city talked about modernization. Residents experienced confiscation, demolition, and policing. School administration carried the same pattern into family life. Attendance boundaries, tracking systems, and uneven capital budgets left many black children in crowded buildings with inexperienced teachers and limited college preparatory offerings, even outside the South. In cities such as New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles, parents could watch suburban districts or selective schools receive newer facilities, while neighborhood schools handled larger enrollments with weaker tax bases. That fed demands for community control because a city that claimed integration in law could still distribute educational power by zip code and board procedure. There were alternatives available before the crisis broke wide open. Municipal leaders could have invested in fair housing enforcement, integrated schooling, public transit, and neighborhood development on a different scale. Police departments could have recruited differently, trained differently, and treated patrol as service rather than suppression. Many cities chose instead to protect property values, suburban political alliances, and departmental autonomy. The order before rebellion was therefore not a neutral order that lost its balance. It was an order already organized around unequal protection. The flashpoints of the late 1960s were local, but the pattern was national. In August 1965, Watts erupted after a traffic stop involving Marquette Fry and a confrontation with police in Los Angeles. The uprising lasted 6 days, left dozens dead, and exposed resentment over unemployment, housing, school conditions, and police conduct. Public commentary often described the violence as senseless disorder. Residents and organizers understood it as the explosion of a neighborhood treated as administratively manageable and politically disposable. Newark and Detroit in 1967 deepened the pattern. In Newark, rumors that cab driver John Smith had been beaten in police custody helped ignite days of unrest. In Detroit, a police raid on an after-hours club touched off one of the deadliest uprisings of the era. National Guard units and federal troops entered the city. Tanks and armored vehicles moved through American streets. That image exposed the political structure. The state was showing that it could answer urban grievance with military force more quickly than it could answer it with housing or employment. The Kerner Commission, formerly the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, reported in 1968 that the nation was moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate, and unequal. The commission pointed to segregation, joblessness, police practices, and institutional neglect. Its analysis was striking because it treated rebellion as a political warning rather than a moral defect. Yet many officials ignored the redistributive and structural implications while embracing only the call for better administration and information. Black power organizations pushed beyond appeal and visibility toward local capacity. Stokely Carmichael popularized the term during the Meredith March Against Fear in 1966, giving language to a mood already present in Tennessee and urban neighborhoods. The Black Panther Party, founded in Oakland in October 1966 by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, dramatized the issue of power through armed patrols that monitored police encounters. California law still permitted loaded firearms in public under certain conditions, and the Panthers used legal knowledge as theater and defense. Their patrols were not random militancy. They were political argument in visible form. The Panthers also ran survival programs, free breakfast for children, health clinics, clothing distribution, sickle cell testing, and political education. Those programs tested whether a movement could supply protection and nutrition more reliably than the city or county. If communities are remembered by the state mainly when patrol cars or welfare investigators arrive, then any organization that can deliver food, transportation, medical screening, and disciplined self-defense begins to compete with the state for legitimacy. Local and state officials responded quickly. In May 1967, Panthers entered the California state capitol in Sacramento to protest the Mulford Act, which was designed to end the public carry space the patrols had used. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI then treated the Panthers as a major domestic target under COINTELPRO, using informants, forged letters, conspiracy prosecutions, and coordinated raids with local police. Oakland chapter breakfast sites required donated groceries, volunteer cooks, dawn setup, and parent trust at the same moment that officers and federal agents were mapping names, cars, apartments, and newspaper routes. The contest was therefore logistical as well as ideological. Campus protest and anti-war dissent connected to this urban crisis through the draft and through growing distrust of expertise. The Port Huron Statement in 1962 had already attacked impersonal bureaucracy and called for participatory democracy. By the late 1960s, many black activists and white anti-war organizers alike saw the university, the draft board, and the police station as linked institutions inside a wider system that demanded obedience while hiding power. Draft exposure sharpened the point. Working class and minority young men were more vulnerable to conscription than affluent people with deferments. A government that claimed to defend freedom overseas while leaving urban neighborhoods underprotected at home invited contempt rather than faith. Municipal and federal authorities moved toward law and order as much as reform. The Office of Economic Opportunity and Community Action Programs existed, but they sat beside omnibus crime control legislation, expanded surveillance, riot control doctrine, and pressure on local police departments to improve tactical capacity. Mayors wanted aid without losing command. Police chiefs wanted resources without community oversight. Activists wanted schools, jobs, housing, and control over the institutions that touched them most often. These aims collided in city council chambers, neighborhood meetings, and televised confrontations. The Port Huron Statement called for participatory democracy and condemned apathy inside a bureaucratic system. Those words were typed in a movement meeting where young organizers were trying to give institutional form to a broad feeling that public decisions were happening elsewhere and then descending on ordinary life as administration. In Harlem, Oakland, and Newark, that distance had a harder edge. Residents could be intensely engaged and still remain governed by institutions they did not control. Bureaucracy meant housing authorities, police precincts, draft boards, welfare offices, and school systems that looked procedural while reproducing unequal power. That is why the source works as a tactical instrument here, even though it emerged from SDS rather than a black urban organization. It names a political frustration that crossed movement boundaries. To demand participatory democracy in 1962 was to accuse boards, agencies, and party structures of running consent through managed channels while preserving elite control. Before Vietnam, before Watts, and before Newark, the document had already put a charge on the record. Formal access did not mean authority over the operating logic of the state. The source also has limits, and the limits expose the pressure. Port Huron carried moral urgency, but it did not fully predict how deeply race, policing, and neighborhood disinvestment would define urban confrontation. Black power activists pushed the problem further. They insisted that control over institutions, including police and schools, would be fought block by block, patrol by patrol, and budget by budget. The document therefore exposes both connection and gap, a shared revolt against managerial distance, and a sharp difference in how that distance was lived. Used tactically, the statement helps reveal why style is such a poor summary of the era. Beneath the slogan set a fight over who administers public life and who absorbs the force when those administrators close ranks. Read beside police budgets, riot reports, and Panther patrols. The document stops sounding like campus idealism and starts reading like an early indictment of managerial citizenship. The consequences of black power and urban crisis did not resolve into one clean national lesson. Some cities expanded black political representation, elected black mayors, and opened new channels of neighborhood leadership. Ethnic studies programs, more assertive campus activism, and community health projects changed institutional life. The language of self-determination entered debates over schools, policing, and welfare policy. Federal poverty programs and legal victories created real openings, even when they were partial and fragile. At the same time, the state learned different lessons. Law and order politics hardened. Police departments professionalized, militarized, and expanded intelligence work. Urban unrest was cited to justify stronger sentencing regimes, broader surveillance, and a political rhetoric that cast disorder as proof of failed permissiveness rather than proof of chronic abandonment. Some white voters who had tolerated civil rights in abstract form recoiled when racial conflict appeared in northern streets rather than southern courtrooms. That leaves a hard judgment with no polite exit. If a government answers community distrust by adding patrol cars faster than jobs, clinics, or housing, then it may restore a version of order while deepening the reasons that order is not respected. If a movement insists on local control and self-defense because ordinary channels feel fraudulent, then it still has to confront the fact that armed confrontation and state repression feed each other quickly. The city remains caught between those pressures, and the question of whether public authority can protect without occupying has not actually been settled.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.